If you've been online at all recently, you may have seen the NPC meme. It's a grey person with a completely blank expression that is often used to represent somebody's political opponent who they believe to have no free thought and no critical thinking skills. It's a kind of a way of mocking someone you disagree with online that's been emerging over the last few weeks, maybe even a month. It's an interesting meme because it goes, I think, a little bit deeper than just a joke or just a mocking statement. It seems to get under the skin of some people who find it dehumanizing when they're called an NPC. I should say that NPC, if you don't know, stands for non-player character, and it's a video game term used to describe any character that is not controlled by the player or a player. It's just a person who will say the same thing every time you talk to them. They'll have the same few lines of dialogue.
I heard she was climbing up the chapel just so she could jump off.
She likes jumping off things. That's because she's an idiot.
The origins of this meme are somewhat interesting, but I think that would just be distracting to go into that now. The most important thing for this video is to look into how it's being used and the kind of people who are being described as NPCs. The most common group of people that I've seen likened to the NPC, who I've seen mocked using the NPC meme, is what you might call SJW, social justice warriors, or anybody on the left who has more mainstream opinions that are in line with what the mainstream media is telling people. Although personally I do not trust mainstream media sources much anymore. I'm not one of those people who believes that there's a grand conspiracy or some kind of agenda that the media is pushing. Rather, it's just that there happens to be a certain amount of bias in the people who are working in journalism for one reason or another. But that aside, I think there is a kind of a mainstream opinion that most people feel like they have to uphold when in speaking in public. If you question feminism, for example, or if you question immigration, if you voted for Brexit, it's seen by many people as somewhat shameful, and people will often hide those kinds of beliefs. And the people who do uphold those values that are approved of by the mainstream narrative are the kinds of people who are called NPCs, people who will just watch the news, just listen to what journalists are telling them, and just believe it without thinking about it critically. I wouldn't like to speculate on how large a population that is. It's more of a stereotype of if you want to tell someone they're wrong, you disagree with them, it's funny, or you might find it funny to compare them to a mindless computer game character who has no mind of their own. Although I think that's it's a drastic exaggeration for most people. I do find myself thinking about this meme when talking to people, either online or in real life, and not just the mainstream people, but I find it when talking to people of pretty much any political group. There's always a few people in that group who are not engaging with the beliefs of that group properly, as far as I can tell. It seems like they're just parroting statements that they've heard that they think will make them sound smart, that will help them beat their opposition. They seem not to have considered the counter arguments that they might encounter. They've only engaged with their own opinions on a surface level. Before the NPC meme, I would have referred to these people as the ideologically possessed, although the expression does conjure up a kind of slightly different idea to explain the same phenomenon. The ideological possession kind of makes it sound like the ideology is like an evil spirit possessing someone who is causing them to say and do things. Whereas the NPC title seems to suggest someone who has nothing going on inside at all and is just repeating things that they've heard, or just repeating statements in accordance to the stimuli that they have received, in the same way that a line of code does. I think this is especially easy to see when people are offended about things, when people will state that something is offensive, or it's or that you're a bad person for saying this thing. They're often not speaking for themselves. They don't actually find the offending term offensive. They're not really. They're either not part of the group that would theoretically be offended by this, or it's just it's caused them no emotional turmoil whatsoever. But there's this sort of class of things and opinions that are classified as offensive, that once they are uttered, once an NPC hears these kinds of opinions, once they hear these things, their response is to say that is offensive. It is to try to shame that person for saying those things, whether or not they had any real reaction going on in their own, in their own emotions, in their own mind. They may have not felt anything at all. They know that is offensive, so they feel like they have to call it out. But more broadly than that, I think what indicates to me that a person is an NPC, or somebody that reminds me of the NPC meme, is when they spout these talking points that are extremely common for someone of their political beliefs. They're just repeating what is an extremely common statistic. They're repeating an extremely common argument that they presumably have heard somebody else say. Of course, I'm not expecting everybody on Earth to be 100% original. That would be extremely inefficient, to not use the knowledge of our fellow human beings to seek knowledge. But it is almost creepy sometimes when you're arguing with some people, especially online, and they just bring up something you've heard a million times before and have nothing to back it up. They just state something, and it's sort of the more you argue against it, it's just they keep bringing up the same thing. It's all they have. For example, feminists will often talk about the patriarchy as a catch-all answer for everything bad that is happening in the world, both to women and to men. But if you ask them about evidence for the patriarchy, they'll often talk about sexual harassment statistics, or they'll bring up specific cases of sexual harassment or sexual assault or even rape, or they'll bring up something about wealth distribution and the wage gap between men and women as evidence for this. Those are all pretty important topics to talk about, I think. Talking about the reasons that men and women might earn different amounts of money, what might be causing that, I think that's pretty interesting. And of course, I am concerned about rape statistics and sexual harassment statistics, and the even specific anecdotes can be enlightening. But when you hear them over and over again from people who share these same opinions, it just starts to ring hollow. It sounds shallow. And I see the same thing happening with the opposite end of the spectrum, with men's rights activists and MGTOW, as they talk about divorce laws. They talk about custody statistics. They talk about male suicide. They'll talk about the number of men who have died in combat or the draft. They'll talk about gynocentrism as their sort of mirror image of the patriarchy that explains all of these things. And although, of course, all of those things also are interesting topics to talk about, and they're important things to talk about, and many of them are seriously concerning, but again, it's just when the points are brought up in such a repetitive manner, it does start to ring hollow. And I should say that there are intelligent, critical thinking people on both sides of the gender debate. I'm not talking about all of them. I'm talking about the NPCs that are among their ranks. If you talk to environmentalists, you'll often hear them talk about global warming, species extinction, the fact that we're running out of resources. They'll often use terms that suggest that human beings are ravaging the earth or ruining the earth, that the earth is a beautiful thing that is being raped by human beings. White nationalists or ethno-nationalists will just talk about IQ tests. They'll talk about birth rates. They might list off some of the amazing achievements of white people. And all of these groups, these people, these NPCs that have these beliefs, they'll make you. They'll try to convince you that that is the most important thing going on in the world at the moment, that these issues that they're talking about are the only thing that you should be worried about, that they are so captivating that this is the thing that's going to ruin the world. Like, this is what's making the world wrong, this specific problem. And sometimes they'll even come up with some very poorly thought out solutions for this thing that you hear a lot. They have this one solution that they think will solve all of the world's problems by addressing this one issue. I remember when Nigel Farage was I think it was in 2010 when there was an election in the UK, and UKIP probably wasn't going to win. I don't think anyone was expecting them to win the leadership, but Nigel Farage was campaigning to get more seats for UKIP, the UK Independence Party. They wanted a referendum to get out of the EU. Which is now happening, if in case you haven't heard. But back in 2010, it was a pretty fringe belief. The idea that the UK should not be in the EU was pretty fringe. Like, there were people who believed it, and on the left and the right. Farage was selling UK independence as an immigration issue, and when you watched interviews with him on TV in 2010, he would often come back to immigration over and over again. He'd talk about uncapped, uncontrolled immigration. Like, this is the thing that's causing every single issue. So whenever there was a question about, education, healthcare, whatever it was, the answer would always be immigration. And that really rubbed me the wrong way with Nigel Farage. I've since gained sympathy for the UK independence idea, the idea that we should not be part of the EU. I don't think I'll be making a video about it because I really don't know that much about it, but there's plenty of reasons why the UK should not be part of the EU, and I've actually heard a few good arguments from Nigel Farage on that matter. But to me, immigration is not very persuasive as an issue. It's just too complicated, ethically and economically, all of that. So the fact that he kept coming back to immigration just grated on me. It made it sound like he didn't understand how complex the country was and how many things were conceivably going wrong all at once. I guess that's just my way of saying that this isn't just a left-wing or a mainstream issue. It's a world issue. It's a problem with humanity, is that there seem to be a certain percentage of the population who are just ready to jump on any bandwagon that will have them. I watched Joe Rogan's stand-up routine that's on Netflix. It was either Triggered or Strange Times. They're both on Netflix. Very good stand-up. He's a very funny guy. And in one of them, he was talking about vegans, and he was talking about, there are lots of good reasons to be vegan, and lots of very cool vegans that aren't militant and they're not crazy. But he said that there are some vegans that seem like the only reason they're vegan is because they hadn't found Scientology first. If they got on the wrong plane, they'd join the Taliban. I think there's some truth to that. There are these people who seem to just have any belief that just comes along. They'll just pick it up. And people who watch a few hours of YouTube videos on one topic and then they're completely convinced of this thing. It can make people feel very intelligent. It can feel like they're armed to face the world now with these new facts and these new arguments that they've learned from these people. And I'm not trying to disparage YouTube. I think it's a great information source, but there's also a lot of crazy people on YouTube who are simultaneously very good at convincing people that they have all the answers. But anyway, that's just what I think. I don't know. Maybe you could tell me if you agree with me. I feel like I've probably annoyed a good portion of my entire audience, but that's a price I'm willing to pay for getting this idea out there, because I think it's pretty important to recognise the power of ideological possession. And even if it's just a silly meme about a grey-faced man or genderless person, I think it is it's a pretty cool idea. You may have noticed in my last video that I had this. Those are two toys, I suppose you could call them. They're two little handy devices that are used to teach engineers about injection molding. And since my video about Lego was fairly popular, and I do think that injection molding is an interesting topic, despite what some people say, I plan on doing either a stream or a video soon about injection molding, teaching in depth about how an injection mold tool works and things that you have to avoid when designing for injection molding. So if that seems interesting to you, then let me know, and maybe I'll push it to the top of the pile, because I've got so many ideas for what videos to make that usually they just fester in this huge pile of ideas that I've had for videos. But until next time, have a great week or a few number of days.
Have you heard about Farage? They say that Deirdre came from Oblivion and burned the whole city to the ground.
By the gods!
Yes.
See you.
Good day.